The date is March 20th, 1996. The survivor is Gerhard Sternlicht. I'm Sherry Mattenstein. We're in Forest Hills, New York, in the United States, and we're speaking today in English. The date is March 20th, 1996. Survivor is Gerhard Sternlicht. I'm Sherry Mattenstein. We're in Forest Hills, New York, in the U.S., and we're speaking today in English. Could you tell me your name and spell it, please?
Yeah, my name is Gerhard Sternlicht. My initial is Michael, my initial name. And Sternlicht would be spelled S-T-E-R-N-L-I-C-H-T. My first name Gerhard, G-E-R-H-A-R-D. And my initial name Michael, M-I-C-H-A-E-L.
And that was your name at birth?
That was my name at birth.
Okay, and
Correct.
when were you born?
The 16th of July, 1924.
And how old are you now?
I am now 71.
And where were you born?
In Berlin, Germany.
And that's where you grew up?
That's where I grew up, with a certain intermission. Would you like me to mention that?
Well, when we get to
if
it,
we get to it.
in the story. What did your father do?
My father was a merchant. And he worked for department stores, but he worked also as a salesman on his own.
Was your family observant?
No, we were not observant. Even though we were traditional in so far that on Erev Shabbat, on Friday night, I went very often to synagogue with all the other young people. On high holidays, the whole family went to synagogue, but I could not say that it was an Orthodox or a religious home.
What were
It
the
was not.
holidays like? The Jewish holidays
The
like?
Jewish holidays were very pleasant, very pleasant. You went to synagogue. After synagogue, you met family, or they came to your house, or you went over to their house. Even so, in Berlin, it was part of the family lived close to our house, to our apartment, let me say better. And the other part of the family lived quite on the other side of the city. So, but somehow we got together. And, but the celebrations were not really religious celebrations. It was more holiday which was kept, but there was not an Orthodox atmosphere. Certainly not.
What sorts of things did you enjoy doing when you were boy growing up? Did you like sports, hobbies?
Yeah, I loved always swimming. I loved bicycling. I always enjoyed the gymnastic hour in school. And I was always a big reader. And music came later, not at that time. And these were more or less my hobbies.
What was school like?
School was fine. I never had any special trouble. I was never the best of the class, but I was certainly not the last one either. I was a good in-between medium student.
And what sort of school did you go to?
And I went to the elementary school. I went for close to 2.5, 3 years to a gymnasium, the humanistic gymnasium, and then again for about 2 years to a Jewish school in Berlin. But that was also more or less an elementary school again.
And earlier on, when you were at the first elementary school, were there non-Jewish and the
That was in
gymnasium
Berlin,
non-Jewish?
a non-Jewish elementary school.
Okay.
And the gymnasium was, we lived a few years in Stolp, S-T-O-L-P, which is in Pomerania, in the eastern part, northeastern part of Dottheim, Germany. Not to misunderstand it was not the Eastern Germany of today. It was a whole Germany, but that was in the eastern part, and which belongs today to Poland, and the name is Stupsk, S-T-U-P-S-K. And over there I visited the two and a half years gymnasium, which I just mentioned to you. My parents moved from Berlin to Stolp, that I'm not mistaken, about 1934, and we returned at the end of 1936 to Berlin again. So for that reason I had the two different schools to attend.
And how large was Berlin?
Berlin?
Yeah, population?
The population of Berlin at that time,
Mm-hmm.
no, I have not the exact figure, but I would say it was certainly a city of a few million.
And around how many
inhabitants.
Jews were?
Jews, this I know more or less exact. That was 150,000. 150,000 Jews were in Berlin.
And did you experience anti-Semitism when you were growing up there?
No, I really did not. I did not experience any anti-Semitism, not in Berlin and also not in Stolp. And of course, after we came back to Berlin, and in 1938, on the 9th of November, it's a Crystal Night.
Well, let's, before we get to
Yeah.
Crystal Nacht, you belong to a Zionist group also,
Yes,
don't
I
you?
belong to the Maccabi Hatzair, which was a youth organization oriented for Israel. At that time it was called Palestine, but which is of course today Israel. And in order to get attached to a Jewish country, to Zionism, to start to being a Jew with recognition and knowing where you belong to. And this I enjoyed. It was a youth movement, and the Maccabi Hatzair was as such the part of the Maccabi. The Maccabi was a sport organization. And out of this sport organization, they added this particular Maccabi Hatzair, which was more in contents group, which was to educate also the people in their thinking, in their Jewish Zionist thinking. More or less, I hope I explained it correctly.
When was the first time that you recall hearing mention of Hitler and the rise of the...
Oh, that I do exactly remember. At that time, that means we were already seemingly in 1933 in Stolp, because I mentioned 34. I think it was 33, because at that time, my father, let me say differently, not everybody at that time had a radio. And you had on the streets these loudspeakers. And one of the main streets in all these smaller cities was this Station Street. And on this Station Street, I remember, I was at that time 9 years old. It was short after we arrived in Stolp that my father took me at his hand, and he said once he takes me with him, and we go to this Station Street, because there is a loudspeaker, and we can hear if President Hindenburg, who was at that time at the government, the head of the government, would really take Hitler as his Reichskanzler. And we went to the street, to the Bahnhof Street, and it was late in the evening, very late, and we heard all the news. And I remember coming home, and my father said to my mother, I don't believe that this Hitler will be the Reichskanzler, which Hindenburg agreed to it seemingly. Hindenburg was a president at that time, that Hitler really would stay in power. And he would think no more than 2 weeks, 3 weeks maximum. And out of these 2 and 3 weeks, we all know what came out of it. So I think at that time, the jury, not only my parents, but the jury in general, and certainly the jury in Germany, did not believe that a man like Hitler could get to power. They just didn't believe it. And that is something which, of course, after all this happening, is difficult to understand for us. But seemingly they lived a very pleasant life from all points of view. And my father immigrated to Germany from Poland. He was born in Poland. And my mother was born near the Austrian, Czechoslovakian or Hungarian borders, Geiring, a place like Geiring, which I'm not sure on which border it exactly was, but she grew up in Vienna and came after, with 13 years old, she came to Berlin with my grandmother. So both with their background, you could not believe it. And so that was at that moment. And I guess that really the Jews, up to very late, with exceptions, of course, with exceptions. There were such who said things do look very, very dark. But the majority thought it is a phenomenon which will disappear again. That's what I remember at that time.
When did your parents start talking about sending you away?
That was late. That was after the 9th of November 1938, which is of course a crystal night.
Right. And what was that like for you, Crystal night?
That was a very bad experience, because I went to school. At that time I mentioned I was in the elementary school in Berlin again, and I was in a section which was called Moabit. The school was in Moabit, and I came to school in the morning, and already outside all the teachers were standing and sending us back home. Now, in order to make it clear, the crystal night was a night before, and then we were at home, but in the morning we had to go to school, whatever happened.
What do you remember of Crystal, of that night, though?
Of that night, I don't remember much. I was at home, which means I did not see how they were breaking the glasses and how they were falling over the people. Only, of course, in the morning I went to school already.
What did you see? How did the streets
I
look?
saw on the streets broken glass of windows, of shops and stores. And I saw it, and I knew that on that night before a kind of pogrom happened. Yes, I knew it. But still, all of us went to the school. We wanted to go. You still did go. It is amazing. It's, if you think about it, I mean, today you wonder why parents let their children go to school in that situation. They did let us go, and I know that all the children came there. And we saw the windows broken, and we continued, and then we were told to make a U-turn, to get back home as fast as possible. And then I passed the synagogue in the Fasanenstraße, which is in the western part of Berlin. And I saw the synagogue from far already, the fire. You could see the smoke of the fire, and I continued straight home. Instinctively I knew there is a danger, and I went home. And I came home, and my father was already standing on the corner of the street, and he took me up to the under the roof of the building, of the apartment building. not a penthouse. It was, you know, it was a roof with just wood around you and little windows on the roof, and we were waiting there a whole day, and we did not go out. And then I do think to remember the following day already we went again on the street. And that was the Crystal Night, which I remember very clearly. And once before, I think 2 months before, so, or 1.5 months before, my father had also to hide himself because the Germans made what they called an Aktion, which means an action against the Jews who came from Poland. And he was hiding himself, and after a day or so also on top of this roof, and after a day and a night or so he came back into the apartment, and they did not pick him up. That was because we had not, my parents had not the German citizenship. My father was from Poland. And then only after this November happenings, and my parents tried to get me out because they didn't have any chances yet. We tried it very much with my, which you will see on the list. I had uncles in France, and I had one uncle here in America. But with this uncle in America, it was very difficult to get in touch at all at that time, seemingly. And with France, we tried it and it didn't work. So my parents decided to send me away and to hopefully that I succeed. And then on the 4th of January 1939, I left Holland with a transport of children. I left Berlin with a transport of children to the Netherlands.
What was it like saying goodbye to your parents?
Very bad. My mother did not come to the station. I remember as of today, the door closed. I said goodbye to my mother, and she made it very briefly. And that was it. And my father took me at my hand. We took, I think it was a tramway. We went to the station, to the railway station, where already many parents were with their children, and put us into the train. And my father gave me a kiss, and my mother, of course, gave me a kiss. And that was the last kiss I got from my parents. And I do think my mother took it very difficult. My father tried not to show it. And I was especially, I suffered from leaving my mother. That means that not that I didn't suffer leaving my father, but I was very, very close to my mother. And it was a very difficult day, no doubt about it. So, should I continue?
Yes,
or?
yes, yes. How many children did you go with at that time?
No, how many children? I certainly think there were between 100 and 200 children in the transport. And at that time, mainly the transport left for Holland, for the Netherlands, and for England. And so I came to the Netherlands. I was registered for the Netherlands. All this was done by the Jewish authorities. And then we came to the border of Germany and Holland, and the train was stopped. And all this is, you remember it as of today, we were told from outside, the train was closed. All the doors were locked. And all the children were inside. and we were told from outside to close the windows. It was a regular train. To close the windows. And it was also yelled to us in German, but in a broken German, which means these were Dutch people already. And the Dutch people didn't want any kind of trouble, of course, with the Germans. They wanted us only into Holland. And I remember as they were calling Ramesleute, close the window. And then came the SS, the German police and the SS, to check all the trains. And that took maybe close to an hour, I would say. And the train continued. And the train took, then later in one station we were divided. One group, I think one group went to Rotterdam and one group went to Eindhoven. I belong to the group to Eindhoven, which is in Brabant, and that is a province in the Netherlands, a southern province in the Netherlands, Brabant. And we arrived in the evening, late in the night. It was not anymore evening, it was already night. We arrived in Eindhoven, and there was already a big building assigned to the children, including myself, which was called the Dommelhuis. Dommelhuis. Dommel is a river, and Huis stands for house. So it was the house next to the Dommel River. And we were about 2 or 3 boys in one room. And it was only for boys. We had no girls with us in the Eindhoven. And we were there in Eindhoven. I was about from January till September, I think, September, October. And
So you were there when the war started?
The war started in 39, correct. This war started September 39, but in September 39 I was still in Eindhoven. That on the 1st of September I was still in Eindhoven, to the best of my memory. And then, that means the Second World War, because later we come to the point where they came to Holland. And in Eindhoven we had a few lessons from private teachers, and we also had to work physically a little bit to keep us busy. They put us into a mechanic shop where we learned a few things, and we had also our days off. Each child which could have been attached to a family where we were invited on the weekend for a good meal, because the food was not the best in this home. And there I made friends. With this family and their children, I'm still in contact today. And we were very close. But this was a Gentile family, a very, very pleasant family. And I remember as of today that they were very religious, a Catholic family. And the father always said, if the prayer if they prayed before the meal, Gerhard, you have not to fold your hands if you don't want. Which means I was a Jewish child. But he was very nice and very pleasant, and seemingly he wanted me to understand that I may go my own way in my thinking, and I appreciated that. And that was in Eindhoven still, and I got also to know a Jewish family. the name of this Gentile family would be Marx, family Marx, M-A-R-K-S. And the Jewish family, the name would be Klerikoper, K-L-E-E-R-E-K-O-O-P-E-R, Klerikoper. And they all were nice to me at that time. And I was 14 years old, 14 and a half. And then in October, in the meantime, in Eindhoven, I was all the time in contact with my parents. And they wrote to me, I wrote to them. And from there I was transferred to Wieringen, Werkdorp Wieringen, where I also joined a youth group. I was sent to Wieringen only because of my Zionist background. If most of these children were not Zionists. And so I think I was the only one who was sent to Wieringen because of that Zionist background. And in Wieringen we worked. Wieringen was a place in the north of the Netherlands, not far from the Zuiderzee. I don't know if that means anything to you. The Zuiderzee is a binnensee which the Dutch built in order to have more land, to dry the sea and get more land. And that was part of our work. They sent us out to make trenches in order that the water could flow out and land could be dried and to win. It's like a moorland. And that was part of our work. And from time to time we had to do agricultural work. But that was from time to time. Most of that was that water. And this Werkdorp was interesting layout. It was built after a sample of Israel, at that time Palestine, of the place called Nahalal. And Nahalal is built in a circle. And the barracks of the houses in Nahalal in Israel were at that time built that way, in that circle, and inside you had the center. So this Werkdorp was also built that way. All the, yeah, it is too long, or
no,
if I make it too long, only let me know. It's that Werkdorp was built in the same fashion. And we had in that Werkdorp, we had also, of course, our teachers and instructors and people who took care of us. And but it was difficult because I belonged to the youngest children there. All the others were already 4 or 5 years older, the ones who were there already. And food was all very scarce. We never, I cannot remember that we always were hungry. We really were hungry. It was not enough food for young children to grow up, and was not enough. No, anyway, that was it. And then in April 1940, they decided to send 2 other fellows. One was Max Kellner, and originally from Cologne, who lives now here in Belrose. And one was Zeev Simon, who came also from Cologne, who we 3 and we went to Loosdrecht. So I should continue? Good. And then in April of 1940, we 3 boys sent to Loosdrecht. there was as such the youth aliyah home for children eventually to be sent to Israel, that time Palestine. And in Loosdrecht we worked also with farmers, and which means early in the morning we went out with a bicycle, we went to work, we learned agriculture, we learned the work of a farmer. And in the evening we came again home to this home which was called Loosdrecht for Youth Aliyah. And we had lessons, fundamental lessons, we learned Hebrew, we learned Zionist history, we learned history as such, we had instructors, and it was relatively a very, very pleasant place to be. A very, very pleasant place to be. And in Loosdrecht we got to know, especially, which I want to mention, this Joachim Shushu Simon, who was later one of the key people organizing the hiding of all this group. And I will come to that a little bit later. And in Loosdrecht we had, among others, our Madrichim, which it was called, was Hannah Asher, which lives today in Israel. It was Harry Asher, her husband, who passed away in the meantime. And it was Menachem Pinkov, who eventually also reached Israel, but is not alive anymore. And then came in the time of May 1940, where the Germans were running over Holland and invaded Holland and the Netherlands. And the man in charge in Loosdrecht, the head of this home, was a gentleman by the name of Yaakov Zuravel. He lived in Israel, Palestine at that time, in a kibbutz, and was sent from his movement to Europe to help organizing the youth aliyah. So for that reason he had a British passport, and so he had to make a very difficult choice, or to take the last boat to England, which was seemingly offered to all the British citizens by the British consulate in Amsterdam, I guess. And I do not know, but I guess it was that way, or to stay with us and for a very uncertain future. He decided to go to England. So at that time we were for a little while without the head of the group. And he went to England with his wife and his little boy, his child, where I do not know if my wife mentioned it, she took care of that little boy. And they left. And then we heard, that is all within 1 week, all that happened, that the Germans got over the bridges, over the waterways, and even bridges which were dynamite to put into the air. They just made it. And they were running Holland over. They took us out from Loosdrecht, and they tried to bring us to the north of the Netherlands, which seemingly was the hope of the main offices in Amsterdam, that we could be saved one way or another, be it within Holland, that the Germans would not advance that far into the country, or that maybe it was to the north of Holland, you have again the sea, that somehow it would be possible to get us out over the canal to England. But it didn't work. The Germans were that fast. It was an unbelievable speed they took. And within a few days, that whole country was just occupied, completely occupied. We reached the city of Alkmaar in the north, which is between Amsterdam and Den Helder.
Just back up for a minute. You met your wife?
Oh yes, I didn't mention that because I figured she mentioned all that. Of course, I met my wife in Loosdrecht, and from that time I was all the time together with my wife. But I only figured she mentioned all that. But you are right, I should mention it, of course, too. And my wife was, of course, with me too. And we were in Alkmaar, and the decision was made in Amsterdam to return us to Loosdrecht. And we returned to Loosdrecht, which was at that time already problematic because there were not enough trains. The Germans took care of all the rails. They used the rails and all this transportation. So it was already very difficult to organize enough space for all these young children to get them back to Loosdrecht. At that time we were children, being teenagers. It was just... Anyway, we did reach Loosdrecht, and nothing happened in that place. And next to this home of Loosdrecht was a big other estate, which belonged to a family Waterman. It was a Jewish family, and Mr. Waterman worked in diamonds in Belgium, but his home was in the Netherlands, and they helped us a lot with little things at that time. I mentioned this family Waterman because later this gentleman, Mr. Menachem Pinkoff, married one of their daughters. And they helped us later after we came back to the Netherlands again after the war. So that's why I introduced them now already. And coming back in Loosdrecht, everything went more or less normal. More or less normal. We had no direct contact with the Germans. The Germans did not look yet for a direct contact with us, which means it was a relatively tranquil, in parentheses, and time, this half a year, from May, June, up to October, 4 months. Relatively quiet months. And you saw from time to time a German on the street in the next city, which is Hilversum. And, but it was not that you saw organized troops movements or so. We did not, up to that time. And then now let me be sure that I tell you the years exactly. 40, 41, yeah. In October 1940, after being half a year about in Loosdrecht, my wife, among others, and I, Rosel and I call my wife Rosa, Rosel, R-O-S-E-L. And everybody called her Rosel. We were sent to Elden, which was also a group of Chalutzim, of future pioneers for Israel, but already age-wise between 16 and 19, which means already teenagers. Being in Elden, we had the head in Eldon was a lady by the name Mrs. De Bruyne. She was in Eldon with her daughter, with a little daughter, and she originally came from Amsterdam, where her husband was a very known pediatrician and committed suicide. So she was left with her little daughter and was seemingly interested in that particular job and got it. And she came to Eldon, which is more or less, I would say, a suburb of the city of Arnhem. Now Arnhem is this very known city where the Germans tried to get over the Rhine River into Holland. And in Eldon, we had a piece of land. We had a large orchard, yard with trees. We had a few little animals, like, how you call this? You put them into you feed them. I have a picture of it.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, it's in German Kaninchen. These are these little animals which eat greens. People can have it also as a pet in the garden, you know, in a little house. So we had that particular little for these animals, and it was like a little house we were building for them. And we had bees, and in order to get honey. And that's what we did outside. And there in Eldon, we, as I said, working on the land. We had a few lessons in the evening, and there was the beginning of learning and understanding music. Every Friday night, Mrs. De Bruyne invited all the youngsters into her living room, and she had a lot of records, and we played classical music. And that was the beginning of understanding music. The first year in Eldon, also I would say, the Germans were not in immediate danger to us. We were all the time told, don't be afraid, nothing will happen to us. The Germans promised not to touch this particular home, and you are safe. And up to a moment where things got a little bit more critical, and I had a feeling it is not anymore safe. Now, I mentioned Rosal and I were at that time not married. And I said to myself, I was of the opinion, save yourself if you can. And I mentioned that to all of them. And there was this list, Mr. Simon, Joachim Shushu Simon, which I mentioned, I think, before, who came on the 16th of July, and it might have been very coincidental. He came to Eldon, one of the organizers of this movement to hide and to bring children over, but I come to that, to France and Spain in order to get them to Israel. But I get to that point later. And I talked with Shushu, who was, I don't know, it's written somewhere where he is born. I think in the book it's written,
No.
not necessary. He was about 8 years older than we were. That's why I wanted to know it about 8 years, maximum 10 years older. And he came to convince Mrs. de Bruyne that all our group should get into hiding before the Germans are coming to pick us up. And he told me, Gert, I talked with Linny, that was her first name. I hope I convinced her. Linny de Bruyne was not very enthusiastic about that point. Now I do understand that. She felt safe. She said, even though I was of a different opinion at that time already, Linny thought she can somehow manage that the Germans really keep their promise, not to touch his zone. I was convinced this might not be the case. And I contacted the friends in Eindhoven, and I wanted to run away. I was told at a particular place I could meet somebody of the family, Marx in Eindhoven, which by coincidence was a brother of sister and brothers, and he was a priest. And he should meet me in a certain spot in Elden, in the village, and take me. And I mentioned that to Linny de Bruyne. And she said to me, Gert, if you decide to do that, you would bring all the other people into danger. And I said, do you think you couldn't take me out of the registration of this home? Which was seemingly impossible, because Amsterdam knew where I was. The Jewish organizations knew it. And I understood that it was my obligation not to endanger all the others. And that was a very crucial moment in my life. And I decided to stay in order not to endanger, because of my running away, all the others. And I notified Eindhoven in some way or another they should not meet me. And in one case, after that of my decision, one of the fellows really did do that. In one fashion or another, which I understood. And he was taken by his brother, I think it was. I have no idea if Linny de Bruyne, Mrs. Linny de Bruyne, agreed to it or not. It did hurt me a little bit, but I thought I did the right thing. And I do think up to this day that I did the right thing.
Did he get away successfully?
He came to Israel eventually, yes. He came to Spain, over the Pyrenean mountain to Spain, which I will right away come to that. And he came to Israel and he died lung. I think it was lung cancer. Very nice fellow. A very extremely nice kid. And I personally feel up to date that my decision was right. And I stayed with all of them up to October, I think it was the 3rd or the 4th of October 1940. I do think it was the 4th of October, that the promises the Germans gave to Mrs. de Bruyne were not kept. And suddenly in the morning, I think it was about 6, 7 o'clock in the morning, the Germans came and surrounded the house. And at that moment, I was always I never trusted the Germans, never ever. I was running down into the basement and hoped to escape, then already it did not matter to me, because I knew the Germans were there. They took us. I could not endanger anybody anymore. Nobody could endanger me anymore. We were in it. They took us. They got us. And I wanted via the basement run away. Didn't succeed. I came down. The door opened. There was already a German standing with his shepherd dog. And he asked me, what are you doing here? So I said, we had down in the basement, we had these wooden shoes, these Dutch wooden shoes, klompen. And I said, which we took for work. And I told him I wanted to take this pair of shoes, which of course I wanted only to get out of it, somehow. And he said to me, get up and make yourself ready. So I got up, and all the friends, including Rosel, helped me to pack my knapsack. We all had knapsacks. And part of these pictures which you have here were saved that way. They all helped me, because I was late. Everybody was almost ready. I lost time. And one took a sweater, the other one took a shirt, the other so that to put it into my knapsack. And it was not an incident which I ever heard that Mrs. de Bruyne told me I shouldn't have done it. Seemingly the SS people upstairs didn't know from this incident downstairs. And then we came to Westerbork. They took us with regular trains to Westerbork.
How long did it take to get there?
From Elden to Westerbork, maybe 4 hours. Between 4 and 5 hours, I would say at the time.
Where did they tell you that they were taking you?
They didn't tell us. They maybe told Mrs. de Bruyne. I don't think that we knew it is Westerbork, or at least that we were not sure if it was Westerbork, even though we knew, of course, about Westerbork.
What had you heard about it?
I come to it now. I come right away to that, because that is the story of Westerbork. And we arrived in Westerbork, which was originally a camp which was set up for Jewish German refugees who were not let into the cities of Holland to live, but where the Dutch government kept this camp for the time being for these refugees. It was as such what you call a collective camp, where the Dutch government decided to keep a certain amount of German Jewish refugees with barracks, and it was the whole little village. Now, I do not know if this Westerbork existed before, if it was a military camp or whatever. I'm not sure. I think it was not mentioned even in the book, but it might also be they were building it for that purpose. And so in this Westerbork now you had all the people, these Jewish German refugees, living partly as families, and the new ones coming in who were arrested in the land in Holland. And at that time the Germans had the rails still in front of the camp, which means why I mentioned that it's important for later. Later the transports which were sent to Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen or wherever, later the trains came into the camp. But at that time the train had to stop before. And we were we came out of the train and everybody was assigned to his barracks. And in Westerbork, it was still relatively easy. It was at the same time as a camp collecting the Jews from the Netherlands, it was also a concentration camp. It was the SS, the German SS, were the master of ceremonies. The commandant, the man of the camp was an SS German. Gemmiker was his name. And then you had a local Jewish police. A local Jewish police. The Germans let this police do whatever, of course, the Germans wanted them to do, but they wanted to permit them. They permitted. What they didn't want to permit them, they didn't. So at that time, I worked with all the other young people, the Chalutzim, which were called the pioneers intended for Israel. We worked outside on the field, and we could go out on the field in groups without a big control. There was a control, like if you imagine like an army quarter, but a little barrack where you were standing a soldier and watching you, but it was not really a very strict control. We went out to work, be it to take potatoes out of the ground or to cut haze. You know haze? H-E-A-T-H, haze. We cut it and we put it together, and it could be used for making brooms or things like that. And that was more or less the work. And at that time, I decided again to run away. And I had a feeling nothing good can come out anyway of it. And at that time,
you didn't think that you would make it running away?
No, I wasn't. I was almost convinced the chances to survive with the Germans is a very small one, very remote one. And I knew there was no. Is it too long?
No, keep going.
I did not endanger any more people. There were many people in this camp, and I tried to flee. And I was on my way by myself. As I mentioned, I could get easy out because we had a certain card which gave us a permit with the group to get out. I do not remember even if I was asked for that card or not. And I was running on the way, and there were fields from left and from right, and I saw another person. I met another person on the way, and that he did the same what I did. And suddenly we saw from far a building, which later I knew it was a pub. There was standing somebody in front of that pub. It was again a village. And I think from there out, the Germans were informed. That was, of course, an informer who was standing there, that he saw two of us running away.
When someone had just informed
Correct.
that.
And it took, I think, only a few minutes. And we could see dust behind us, because it is not a paved street where we went. It was roads, little land roads, and car, automobile came and stopped. And we were taught to get into this automobile, into this car. The German The driver was a Dutch fellow. The man next to him was a German SS. And he asked this very cruel question to the driver: tell these two fellows in the back where usually eventually we are taking the people we catch with this auto. And he said, Mauthausen. Now Mauthausen was already at that time known as one of the worst that you had in Austria, where you had rucks to get out from the mountains and all that. We both listened to it, and that was all. No, we didn't talk at all. And we were delivered within the Camp Westerbork again to the Dutch police, which was called the Marchaussee. I have to emphasize, the German didn't touch us. He did not touch us. Seemingly, we looked too dirty for him to touch us. Then we both were taken into the internal prison of Westerbork, which again had internal prison, a few cells. And I was, like the other fellow, received by the head of the Marchaussee, which was the Dutch police, not the Jewish police inside. That was the COD, the OD organization, something OD, Organisationsdienst OD. But that was from the Marchaussee, the general police in the Netherlands, which were not Jewish. And it was Mr. de Jong. Jong or de Jong was his name. And he just let me have it. And good. He just let me have it. Unbelievable. The cruelty, it's unbelievable. And
how badly did he beat you?
You wouldn't. I was black and blue all over. And why I emphasize it, that was a Dutchman. Which means, of course, it was known that in Holland you had an organization, the NSB, the Nederlandse Sociaal Democratic Partij, which was, of course, a pro-Nazi party. And without knowing that this man was certainly one of them. And, but you know, young, if you're young, 15, 16, 17 years old, you can have a lot of abuse. And then I came into a cell where he put me in, and there was another gentleman already in, much older than I, between 40 and 50. It was a terrible smell in that cell. This gentleman was, of course, sick, could not control anymore his functions. It was an awful thing. It was an awful thing to have a man in that position under the supervision of the Dutch police, and in order another young fellow like I to put him in there too. Anyway, I couldn't help this gentleman. What could I help? I was myself. I had no food. I had no water. What could I help him? And somehow I got the message out. I cannot tell you how. I do not remember it how. Maybe they were informed in the camp, the registration, that I was caught. But all of the friends, all of them knew that I was caught in that prison. And Rosel visited me there and brought me the last things before we thought I would be transported to Germany. She brought me some food and some clothing which this Dutch police, this seemingly de Jong, this commandant, agreed to because I was under 18 years old. Also Mrs. de Bruyn, Linne de Bruyn, from Elden, which I mentioned before, she came to visit me. And then came twice a week, or first once a week and then twice a week, were always days of transport to Germany or to Poland, wherever. We didn't know, but we figured to Germany or Poland. And once or twice I was not called. And then I think I was in this thing about 10 days or so. An evening before I was registered, and I knew the next morning I will be on transport. It was called on transport. And really the next morning we were taken out of the prison. We had to stand in line. And we got a big S sign here on our arm. S means Strafe. Strafe means punishment. Because we were outcoming of this prison. In general terms, if all the people who were in the camp had to go to the trains for transport, they did not have that S. Only if you came out of that little thing there, of that prison. So I had that S here. And they somehow pinned it on also. And we were brought to the train. The train, now you will understand why I mentioned that the trains were still outside of the camp. The rails did not go into the camp. Later they did. And on my way out, I saw a good friend, one of the friends, all our group. And I knew I had to get with the S to the first train, where all the people had to get in, who seemingly were special, got a special reception in Auschwitz. And somehow I knew I have nothing anymore to lose. I have that S. I will get to that first train. There is nothing connected. It's not guts, it's not heroism, it's nothing. It's just self-preservation. And it is something that you have inside and you say, it's my last chance. So I cannot tell you how it got into my head. I told him, call Gerhard Sternlicht, back into the Registratur, back to registration. Believe it or not, I was walking and there comes the fellow in. Gerhard Sternlicht, back to the registration, back to the registration. I took my knapsack, which I had on my hand. I threw it between two trains. You know, there's always a little bit space on the other side of the train where seemingly the Germans did not walk. The Germans only walked with us, these SS people. And that knapsack on the other side, I made a U-turn and back into the camp. And in this camp, I went into the toilet and I waited up to the late afternoon, evening, that I heard the engine giving a sign that the train is leaving. You heard that engine. They gave it, it's like a signal. And I heard that from this toilet, and which was very close to the registration, but I didn't go to the registration yet because I knew they had no idea. He only helped me to get me in. And then the train left, and I knew the train left. I got out. Longer I had not to stay in the toilet, nothing would help me. And I went to the registration, and there Mr. Samson, who was the father of a very good friend of ours, still from Elden, he convinced the people in charge there, the Jewish people, who were working on the registration. That was all in the hands of our own people, to re-register me into the camp, as of I came today into the camp, and that saved me. And I got back into my old barrack with all the people, and the way I understand, after they heard that Gerhard is back in the camp, almost they couldn't believe it. Which it was just, and here you really ask yourself if it's something which God tells you to do or not. Is there a higher power? Is there not a higher power? Is there something who is much more intelligent and smart than you are yourself, who is directing you and guiding you? You feel somehow humble and just unbelievable. It is a kind of destiny. It's faith, and that was more or less my reaction on all that.
How did you feel about God at the time?
I tell you, very often I ask myself, if there is really a God, why did all this happen? On the other hand, you see how I was saved. So seemingly there is yes a God. Very unclear. No permanent answer to that. Absolutely, I could not say that I was religious. No. But I said it's a higher power. It's destiny. And today it reminds me really, because you ask about if it's is God or not God. There was a girl in Warsaw during the ghetto time in Warsaw, and the fighting in the woods, where this little girl wrote a poem to the Almighty and said, do me only one favor, one day decide not to spill only Jewish blood. It reminds me. Now the question is, was that girl religious, not religious? She talked to God, but she said, why are you doing it? One day only, don't let our Jewish blood flow. So it's a thing very difficult to answer. And anyway, at that time, then we were again together. I had once a little other episode that we had.
What happened that time?
In Westerbork, we had to work with, how you call it, these little wagons which you push. It's on wheels.
Wheelbarrow?
Wheelbarrow, that's right. A wheelbarrow which you had to push. And one friend of mine, Jack Schnitzler, I knew his brother from Elden. We didn't work, but we were standing and resting. And an SS man came across and saw us, and I had 2 weeks punishment to work harder, which means you had to go in the morning early with a particular group, and you came at night a little bit later home, but it was under supervision of the Jewish local police. So it was not that bad. But that was the second time. But that was our own mistake. We should have worked. We didn't work. Of course, we tried not to work as hard as we had to if we were not in need to. You worked, you looked almost around you. If you saw the SS, you worked. If they were away, you tried for a moment to rest. And that's, of course, the way many people had to pay that little punishment. And that was nothing. And in comparison. And that was up to the very end. And then
Did you know what was happening with your family at that time? Did you have any idea?
Oh, good. I had to, you see, could I go back to Wiering for a moment? Mm-hmm. I was called in Wiering in a short time before I came to Loosrecht by the management of that particular Werkdorp Wiering, and I was shown a letter of my mother where she wrote to this management she should inform me that my father passed away in the concentration camp in Oranienburg, Sachsenhausen. So yeah, I was informed of that at that time. So I knew my father was not alive anymore. And in the meantime, I also received a letter from my mother. But my mother waited at that time for quite a few weeks until she was sure I was informed. She seemingly had not the heart to tell me that herself, and the courage to tell me that herself. And now we were in Westerbork again. And then on January, I think it was the first, but first or second of 1943. In November,
You should talk about getting married.
in November 1900 and in my subconscious, as Rosel told you, in November 1943, on the 22nd of November, it was decided between Rosel and myself and 3 or 4 other couples, whatever should be, we hope if we are married officially, which was very young, we were 18 or 19 years old, we would be sent by the Germans to the same place, to the same camp, to the same concentration camp, and not be separated. That was at that time the reason for getting married. And that was possible in Westerbork because the Germans seemingly did let it go, permitted it, and the Jewish registration in charge of us, they could contact the next city, which was Assen, A-S-S-E-N. From there, the clerk from City Hall came and married us 3 or 4 couples together. Late at night, with strong rain coming down, I remember that. And we were married about 12 o'clock midnight, that was the time. So officially, we had the same names. And if the Germans went to the registration, they would call both of us. And then we decided if once after the war we do not want to stay anymore together, no, then it's fine. But at that particular moment, we felt we should do that. And which eventually, of course, as you can see, we decided to stay together. And we were married according to Jewish law in Israel, in Hazoria, but that is later. And
But that was later in Palestine.
that was later in Palestine,
Yeah.
yeah, what is today Israel. And then we...
Wasn't it also that you had like certificates exchanged for
Yeah, that
people in this,
comes now.
Yeah,
That
okay.
comes now into the story. In the meantime, organizations outside were working for us, for the Chalutzim, mainly in Switzerland, in Geneva, to get certificates, permits, to get into Palestine, that the English would permit us to get into Palestine, because Palestine was under their mandate at that time, the English mandate, and in exchange for Germans living in Sarona, which is part of Tel Aviv, maybe a little suburb of Tel Aviv, where Germans were living already for a long time. I think it was a certain sect, the Temple sects, which lived there, a kind of a religious sect, and where the Germans were interested to get them out, and where they agreed to send us not to Auschwitz but to Bergen-Belsen, and in case this exchange can take place. And we were told that was the case, that we have a chance to be exchanged. And we knew then also that our train would leave for Bergen-Belsen and not for Auschwitz. We knew that too. And then we were loaded on the train and we arrived in...
What was that transport like?
The transport was relatively favorable because we were still not in cattle cars. We were in regular cars, trains, and seemingly in order not, in case we would be exchanged, that we could not tell we were in cattle cars. And of course in Kattegat we were later, which we come to it. And then we arrived in Bergen-Belsen, and the reception was already clear to us that it was an absolutely concentration camp. There were no two ways about it.
What did you see?
We
when
came
you
out
went there?
of the train. There were standing SS with their shepherd's dogs, relatively rough, not very easy, but not as rough as in Auschwitz, but certainly not friendly.
What did you see them doing?
And they were pushing a little bit. They were pushing a little bit. They were a little bit with their stick going around and giving military commands. That means that was already not a very gentle reception. But in comparison, what we know now, it could have been even worse. And then the girls came into the site for the ladies in barracks. We boys came into the site where the men were into barracks. And because we still had this privileged status, in parentheses, our group were permitted at night, in the evening, 1 hour to see each other and to meet the girls in their barracks, which means we the fellows had to go over to the girls. You understand, we were one group. And that privilege, seemingly, they kept that promise regarding if that exchange took place. And at that time, I worked in the beginning in the shoe commando. That means the leather of the shoes was cut from the sole. And seemingly the Germans used the leather. And these shoes came in heaps, like mountains. And we were put into barracks and had to cut it on tables. The food was just to exist, hardly to exist. You got a thing of soup in the evening. You got soup, but water. There was no vegetable, no potatoes, almost nothing in it. And that kept us going, that little soup. And Rosel brought me from time to time. She worked in the kitchen. And she smuggled out a little piece of bread, a little piece of butter, a little bit of sugar. And that helped, of course. And then I worked in the Stubbenkommando. Now the Stubbenkommando is where you take the roots from trees out of the ground. Relatively hard work. And certainly in the wintertime if it's frozen and all that. And of course we went out with 20 people, and I think the next morning you had only 18. One was missing. In the morning we had to get up for the roll call before we went to work. There were already people falling during the roll call. And that was already the privilege. That was the privilege regarding the exchange. And in that Sturmkommando I had an SS man who was called the intellectual, an intellectual fellow. He only came with white gloves. He never touched us, but he was as mean as possible, as mean as could be. He asked us at one occasion, there was a big puddle with water on the way from rain, and he asked us the question, what is the difference between you and the children of Israel at the time they left Egypt? Imagine a question like that. Nobody answered. Who would volunteer to answer? So he said, I will tell you. At that time the children of Israel had a God who helps them to get over the Red Sea. You don't have a God. who's watching you. And he put us through that water to our work. Now that is a cruelty. I don't already about the physical cruelty, I talk about the mental cruelty. To stop and to ask that question. It could not be much more cruel. Anyway, we continued walking and working and coming back to the camp, and were counted. In Bergen-Belsen you were counted. That was already not like in Westerbork. That was strict count one by one. And you heard from time to time airplanes going very high over the camp. But this we knew. These were the planes bombarding Berlin or Dresden. We knew it. You heard all this kind of rumors and all that. And we hoped the day would come. That's the end. But the day did not come that fast. And once they asked for volunteers, it's a roll call, for 2 volunteers. Now, I never believed in volunteering. And I said, the best thing is just try your best in the middle of the road. If you volunteer with Germans, not much good can come out of that one. And there were 2 fellows who did volunteer, certainly in the hope to get better food, because the food was almost, we were hungry for 24 hours. So I don't blame them. I understood it fully. And they volunteered, and we saw them then the next weeks walking on the main street through the fence in presence of an SS man. And they had a little barrack at the very end of that road. We knew that barrack. We could see it. But we could not get any contact with them. We could not get any contact with them. And after the war, of course, we knew what they did. I think you gave a sign.
No, keep going.
After the war, of course, we knew what they did. They had to take out the golden teeth of the mouth of the skeleton. And they did not survive. They did not survive. Both of them did not return. They are not here anymore. So I mentioned this especially, this particular event with these 2 friends, because at that moment, more or less, we realized that things look very bad. But on the other hand, the Germans really did send 2 or 3 transports from Bergen-Belsen to Israel, to Palestine, what it was at that time, but only for the girls, and only the girls who were not married. Because all the boys and fellows in my age at that time who could serve in the army and could get maybe to Palestine and fight against the Germans, they wouldn't let us out. So for that reason, Rose could not join either one of the transports because she was married to me. If we would have done that before, known before, but we didn't, right? So she was stuck in Bergen-Belsen. And I felt very bad about it. But I knew we acted at that time according to the best of our knowledge, what we thought. So even though this 2 or 3 transports left, things got stickier and stickier for the ones who stayed behind. And certainly after that particular experience with his 2 friends, it looked bad.
What was happening that got stickier and stickier? What was happening that was worse?
The SS got more rabiat, more antagonistic, more physically. We were handled a little bit rougher. On the roll call, certainly.
What were they doing on the roll call?
Pushing. From time to time with their hands or with their guns. With the guns, give them a clap, you know. And more people did fall. How long could they keep going without food? Without right food, enough food. And after that Sturmkommando, I somehow was taught to work in a clothing magazine. It was called the Effektenkammer. These were clothes from all people who came to camps from all over Germany, seemingly. The civil clothes. And we had to put blouses to blouses, shirts to shirts, slacks to slacks. And it was like a magazine of clothing, and which was not that I volunteered. I was told, 1, 2, 3, go. And I went, without actually knowing that I go there. Only at the time we arrived, we knew what was the work I was taking out. And that was an SS man who did very little border us. I worked with 2 or 3 other fellows there. He did not border us very much. And I do not remember having that he touched us. But
What were the uniforms like that you were wearing?
SS.
No, that you were.
All our people were in our regular clothing which we brought, civil clothing, because of this agreement,
Because of the agreement.
the exchange, up to the last moment. And even though the hair was not cut. But food and the way they handled us, there was almost no difference. There was almost no difference. We worked in the same commandos like all the others. We got the same food like all the others. But we had our clothes. And the barracks, I do not know if the barracks, these were the same barracks from outside. And I guess inside was no difference either. These were these beds, 3, 1, 2, 3. It might be later, if at the time they were overfilled, that these people had to sleep maybe on the ground. And at that, I reached the last half year where I said it gets tougher, and I came to the clothing magazine. There were 2 people, they were especially rough and brutal. One was called Der Rote Müller, the Red Miller, because he was so red in his face. And the other was Rau, Oberscharführer Rau. And this Oberscharführer Rau and Mr. Miller were always part of the roll call. But that Miller, that Red Miller, he made always his visits all over where you worked. And he just let us have it from left and from right. And the only thing what you could do, you were running away. You just were running away, you were running from this corner to this corner. It was within the magazine. And eventually he left you. Whoever got it, got it. Whoever didn't was lucky enough not to get it. And he was just, it was not any more human being, that man. And I was told later he died of typhus in the camp already, because also then eventually the Germans got it after the liberation. And seemingly that was his punishment at the end. Anyway, at the very last few months, we came into the train, I think, on the 13th of April, 1945. We arrived in Tröbitz, I think it was the 23rd of April, 10 days or 15 days.
But you didn't really talk
Yeah.
about the
But,
transport.
Yeah,
Okay.
I figured out for myself, so it was about December 1944. I would say roughly December, that things got extremely bad. That we saw already. It was not anymore a privilege regarding that exchange. It got as bad as it could be. And more people couldn't make it. But relatively still more than, let me say, in Auschwitz, of course. Then I saw one day there was another camp next to us which was separated through a fence. And we saw on this, behind that fence, one of these fellows from Holland, of our group, who was hiding, and they caught him. And we saw him already almost as a skeleton sitting in front of that barrack. And I'm sure he recognized us. But you had to be very careful because you had all over the towers. On each end you had a tower with Germans, with SS looking at you. So you could not make it too obvious that you see him. And we tried to get food to him. I have no idea if he reached it ever. Because all these people were that sick, and whoever was stronger could get it. I have no idea up to this date if he really succeeded in getting that little piece of bread. We tried it, all of us tried it. And that was Kurt Pollack from Bochum. And that was the beginning already, that Rosel did not work anymore in the kitchen, where she, through her work, could save her own life, and saved certainly my life, with these little things she was able to bring me. In the meantime, I had, how you call it, if you get yellow into your face.
Jaundice?
Yeah, very much so. And I was in between very sick. But the sugar which Rosel could bring me helped me a little bit to get over it. And I still had in my knapsack, Rosel had it too, a little milk, condensed milk, which is sweet, which we opened. That was really the ratio for emergency, which we opened at a time. And I was young and I got over it, over that particular sickness. But that is miserable. Certainly if you are helpless. And I did not get into there were barracks for the sick people, but I didn't want to get in there. Because
What happened to people
I
who
was
went to the
afraid.
hospital?
I was afraid.
Yeah.
They would not let me out again, you know. So I didn't. And yes, there were a few people, I think, that survived at the very end, who were in a hospital after the liberation. And then came the difficult months where still I had again a little bit strength. I was not anymore that sick. And all the other fellows from our group, we were young. We were younger than the average. And we were given the task to bring from the kitchen big, how you call it, where the soups are in, like in military, I don't know how you call it, we called it caramel, which means that you put in soup and then you give it and so you take this one on this end, the other one the other side of the caramel on two handles, and that way you carry it. And they were heavy. They were heavy. Water is heavy. But we made it, and that way I was able a little bit to reciprocate for Rosel to bring her a little bit soup. Which, of course, now she started to be hungry, right? She was not in the kitchen. So it was destiny, what can I tell you? That we worked, and that was almost up to the very end. We fellows were always assigned to go to the kitchen to pick up this camel, which it was called, and bring it to the camp. And once in that kitchen we saw a girl from our group, from Holland, which was also hidden and caught. And somehow we knew she was outside with a capo. I don't know if you know what is a capo. A capo is the man or woman which the Germans, out of the prisoners, decided they should watch the other prisoners. And we knew she is outside among the other prisoners in front of this yard with a capo. And she tried to come into the kitchen, into that barrack. And I cannot tell you how she knew about it, how she got to know about it. She knew there are Dutch fellows inside from Holland. And we tried to give her food. And at that moment, the capo came with an SS lady, with a woman, SS woman, and they gave it to her. And she never got that food. But she survived. She survived. And she lives in Haifa, in Israel. And it was a terrible moment if you cannot help. That's the worst. That's the worse than if you feel bad yourself. If somebody else is in that situation and you try to reach hand and there comes this. And she really got it awful. She had a kind of something on her head, of course without hair. It was without hair, but we right away recognized her. So that was that little in between what happened. And then on, as I said, then came the end, we were called for a roll call. And there were already rumors that the Allied forces were very close. And we were already, but again, you didn't know for sure. But there were rumors that the Allied, that the war had a very bad end for the Germans already. But not yet the end. And we came to the last roll call, and they started, the Germans, this SS people got already crazy. They were shooting into the air. And they decided that these people will be transported to, we heard again with rumor, it should be Theresienstadt. Theresienstadt was in Czechoslovakia and was the last camp and ghetto which was still in the hands of the Germans. Because now Germany got smaller and smaller, right? The Allied forces came from the west, the Russians came from the east, there was not much left. So they took us into a train, and this time it was a cattle train. And we started again, we had to march towards the train, and we were, I think at that time we kept together. The Germans already, they couldn't care less. As long as you get into that cattle car, I said the first train, the second car, the third car, in. So Rose and I, of course, we tried to be together again. Somehow the girls and the boys met somehow. I can tell you, I think we went together out. I almost think we went together out of the camp. The girls from the barracks and we with our barracks, and we met there next to the cattle car, or before already, but we were in one. Rose and I were in one cattle car. We managed that. And we started with our journey. We came after the second or third day. I think we were about 10 days or 12 days on the way. Second day, third, we had all the time attacks from the English or American planes or the French planes. They wanted to keep that engine, to stop that engine of the train. They didn't know who was in that train. They figured these are Germans. So we had one bombardment after another. But the Germans did let us out. The cattle cars, the doors were open. They did let us jump out and lie down on the fields. And you have to lie down. You don't stand if you bombardment. You lie down and as deep as possible that whatever comes over you and not on you. So in this cattle, these attacks were quite a few times. Once Rosel decided already she cannot take it anymore. And she wanted to go, somehow to go away. She didn't know where to go away. It was open field. I said, Rosel, don't do it, because within Germany you have maybe forces who will harm us. Don't do it. Anyway, she didn't do it. And we came back and we lived on this journey from red beets, which we found, and potatoes in the field. And that's what we lived from. With a knife, somehow we had a knife, we cut it and we were eating it.
Did a lot of people die?
I think on all, I know for sure, 500 died in Tröbitz, where we will right away reach. On the way to Tröbitz, not too many, a few. But I think up to the Tröbitz, which right away you will see what the Tröbitz is. We come to it. Most of them survived. And then we went over a bridge next to the place of Wittenberg, which went over one of the rivers. And we only went over the bridge, and that bridge was hit by this bombardment. So again, you can ask yourself, is God did it to us that we were saved? Who knows? But right, the last train was over, and that bridge fell. And we were already on the other side. So that happened on the way. And then the train took us through Berlin, and that was again after so many years that I saw Berlin, because on Berlin had already at my time elevated train net, and the Germans tried this elevated train net to use in order to function. There was not much left, and we saw already all the bombarded houses of the city, and we continued after Berlin, maybe another few days, and we got into a wood. The train stopped in a wood, in a forest. And suddenly the SS people were not there anymore. They only had the German uniforms of soldiers, the German Wehrmacht. So that looked already strange. The SS uniform, they don't have it anymore, don't wear it anymore. They wear the uniform of a regular soldier, right? So, and eventually, the next morning, they were gone completely. Gone. We were on our own, in this forest, in this wood. No, we thought we were on our own, out, and just walk. Where's food? Food, that was all what it was in your mind.
How did you feel when you realized you were all alone, not being guarded?
Very strange. This realization comes later. You are still in this, how should I say, like an anesthesia, you know, you are still, you cannot believe it. You just cannot believe it. I mean, so suddenly, you come out and there's nobody anymore there of these people. And we walked, and then already the Russians came toward us. And the Russian army, very tired. You could see they had a long way behind them. And we came to this little village, Tröbitz, where then we were told we can take any house where we want and find room. We can live there. Because the Germans left that village, they were afraid not to be caught by the Russians. If already they have to surrender, they would have preferred to surrender to the English or the French or the Americans. So we had plenty of room suddenly. And Rosel and I and two other couples, we took one house with 3 apartments. And the first thing we looked for food. We found a store, we found food. And we found some food in the basement of this house. And Rosel got sick. Rosel got typhus and fever. And but we tried to take care of her, like everybody else who was sick, and she recovered. The fever left her, and food was there. But of course, after, for so long you have no food, you may not eat too much at once, and which has bad results. The stomach would not digest it. So slowly, and the Russians put us into their lazaret, that is a hospital, where our lyses, we were full of lyses from the camp, we were cleaned. And we tried to make the best of it, and we hoped as soon as possible to get to the other side of the demarcation line. The Russians were interested to convince us to stay with them. They believed in their system. We did not believe in their system. So we worked very hard on it to get over until, and we were there about 2 months. And I remember the 1st of May, where we called all on the marketplace, where we were told the 1st of May is a day for the workers. And we have to believe in their system, in the communist system, etc. And but we knew exactly what we wanted. We didn't want anything of their system, and we wanted to Palestine. We wanted to get to Israel. And eventually, a French soldier looked for his wife, which was imprisoned, and he heard about this place, Tröbitz, where we were, and he came and found us, all of us, including his wife. And then he seemingly went back to the western side, to the French, to the English, to the Americans, and let them know that we are there. And within a few days, their big communes came with this tall, very beautiful looking black gentleman with his big eyes and strong, and helping us getting on this commune, and were nice, and they gave us food, and all this were, the drivers were mainly of the black community. Many soldiers of their community. They were extremely helpful and extremely nice and pleasant to assist us in our situation. So, and then we came to the place which is called Torgau. And in Torgau, all the communes had to stop and for 1 minute to stay silent. And you saw a big picture from Churchill and Truman, President Truman, and Stalin. So these are the 3 big politicians who had a victory over Germany. And then it was not Roosevelt, it was Truman, I think, already. Was it 45? Was it a picture from Truman or Roosevelt? I almost think it was already Truman's picture. And certainly Churchill and Stalin. And after that 1 minute standing, we continued with our way to Leipzig. And in Leipzig, I would say these were big caserns for soldiers, a camp for soldiers, and where we were SDPs, as displaced persons, brought in. And there we were about a week to 14 days, 8 to 14 days, until we got the permission to return to the Netherlands because of the law that everybody has a right to return to the country where he was arrested by the Germans. And somehow we made it to the Netherlands by train. And arriving in the Netherlands, the Dutch did not want to let us stay in Holland because we were not born Dutch people. Both of us were born in Germany. And so a few others were also born in Germany. We were put into a church in the city of Maastricht, and the people who were Dutch origin, born in Holland, they could continue their way to Amsterdam or wherever they wanted to go. And then already in Maastricht, the friends of ours from Eindhoven, which I mentioned before, the lady came. She was in London at the time of the liberation, and through the Red Cross in London, she right away knew we were on the list, Rose and I, that we survived. And she came to Holland direct to see us. And she gave us a little money in Maastricht for the first few days that we could manage. And that way we had to see that we got over the Rhine River in Arnhem in order to be inside of Holland. That the Dutch already